Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about projection and transference. Okay, so today's video is all about projection and transference. So let me first get some definitions of those going. So basically starting with projection. Projection is where we take parts of the self that we've repressed away, that we're unconscious to, and we project them out onto other people. And transference is where the feelings that we feel about a particular person, we start to essentially transfer them onto someone else. Now, when it comes to projection and transference, this isn't a perfect definition because it isn't just other individual people that we project and transfer onto. We can also transfer and project onto the universe at large, onto our God images, onto groups of people, and many, many other things. But for today, we're going to be mostly talking about transferring and projecting onto another individual. Now, when we project parts of ourselves onto others, or we transfer certain feelings we have about certain people toward others, it tends to create a lot of issues with connection and intimacy. So if we're always seeing people through our own projections and our own transferences, we're missing the actual reality of how a person is, and it can create a lot of barriers between ourselves and another person. And our projections and transferences can become so strong that it's almost like we're on our own little bubble, insulated off from all other elements of reality. So we can feel very disconnected as a result of our projections and transferences. Now, projection and transference are also deeply intertwined with the workings of the shadow. Basically, when we repress these parts of ourselves, or we repress these feelings that we have about a particular individual, we will sort of project and transfer them out as a hard rule. And the more things that we put into the shadow, the more we're going to project and transfer. And when we do this, we tend to end up with very polarized feelings about whoever we're projecting and transferring onto. We're either going to put that person up on a pedestal and feel this extreme level of admiration, or we'll oftentimes feel very negatively about that person and start judging. So the reason why we put someone up on a pedestal is because we see them as a reflection of the parts of ourselves that we feel uncomfortable integrating within ourselves. And so when we project a repressed trait or certain repressed feelings onto another person, we see that person as someone that's going to complete us because they're essentially becoming a blank projection screen for the parts of ourself that we have disintegrated within ourselves. Now, when it comes to projection and transference that leads into the negative kind of feelings about someone, sometimes we have really, really harsh judgments about certain qualities that we ourselves might have, or we might have very negative feelings toward another person. And so sometimes if we project or transfer onto somebody, we're going to feel really, really negative about that person because we can see those parts of ourselves that we don't like in that other person. So I want to give you some extended examples of projection and transference so you get a really solid sense of how projection and transference work. So let me go into an example of projection first. So let's say there's a guy named Jerome, and Jerome has really, really harsh judgments toward people who seek attention. So whenever he sees people seeking attention, he tends to look very, very negatively upon that. He tends to judge it very harshly. Now, simultaneously, Jerome is also a workaholic. And so he's constantly working on new things at work, and he's always kind of imagining that when he creates these new things at work or when he does a good job, he's going to be acknowledged and appreciated. And it's just a constant fantasy that goes on in the background of his mind. And Jerome feels very disappointed when the people in his life don't notice his hard work. He feels very upset because his bid for attention has not been recognized. Now, Jerome's conception of himself is that he doesn't need attention at all, and he sees attention seeking as a very negative, weak behavior. And so he's not even really aware that he's seeking attention. He kind of sees it in a different light. He sees it as, oh, I just want to be recognized for the things that I create. And so he's kind of going in an around the bend kind of way to try to get attention in a way where he doesn't have to see it as seeking attention. But if he's really honest with himself, he'll see that his constant fantasies about his coworkers and his boss acknowledging his hard work are really just about getting attention. Now, one day at work, he sees his new coworker, Greg, and Greg is asking people directly for support because he's going through something. And Jerome has a really negative judgment about this because it's sort of like, oh, he's not even doing anything to get that attention and he's just attention seeking. And so he decides that Greg is an untrustworthy person. And Jerome just can't put his finger on what specifically he doesn't like about Greg. He just knows that he doesn't like Greg and he doesn't trust Greg. Now, the reality of the situation is that in childhood, Jerome actually really needed attention but wasn't able to get it. And so he eventually repressed that aspect that needed attention, and he even created a worldview around why seeking attention was negative, because feeling that feeling of needing attention would have been too intense to be with. And so instead of feeling that desperation of needing attention, he's repressed that aspect of himself. And now, when he sees other people, including his coworker Greg, seeking attention, he's projecting that part of himself out onto Greg and those other people. And because of that, these other people are getting a really harsh judgment because when he sees that part of himself outside of himself, he has an aversion to it. And so he's repressed away this part of himself that needs attention, and now he's projecting it onto others. And despite having repressed these needs for attention, they're still very much showing up. He now is working himself to the bone, and his unconscious goal and his motive is to get attention through his work. And when that doesn't happen, he feels resentful and he feels disappointed. And sometimes Jerome will even see attention-seeking behaviors in others when they don't have attention-seeking behaviors. Like, so if a person just so happens to express certain emotions, because that's just how they're feeling at the time, Jerome will see that as a bid for attention. So if somebody happens to, let's say, not be able to hold back and they start crying in public, Jerome will kind of think to himself, it's like, oh, that person's seeking so much attention. And will think sort of negative judgments about that person. So that's an example of projection where basically Jerome has repressed this part of himself and now he's projecting it out onto others and he's judging others as a result. All right, so that was an example of projection, and now we're going to go into an extended example of transference, which, if you recall, is where we transfer certain emotions that we feel about one person onto another person. So in this example, let's say that we have a woman named Sharon. And when Sharon was a child, she had a dynamic with her mom where her mom was very inconsistent with her attention and with her love. And so basically, whenever Sharon was perfectly conforming to her mother's expectations, her mom would shower her with praise and, almost like put her up on a pedestal and essentially be treating her like a total golden child. But whenever Sharon would step even a toe out of line, so if Sharon was only 99% perfect, her mom would get spiteful and would stonewall her and, basically hold a grudge for either a day or days on end. And because Sharon was a small child at the time, whenever her mom would act this way and would stonewall her, Sharon would feel really anxious and really sad and would beg her mom to still love her and to not leave her. And because of this intense reaction, she would do her best to fit the expectation of her mother to the T. And this dynamic went on till Sharon was about 8 years old. And at this point, she had started to develop some of her own personality traits, and her mom's expectations got even more strict because her mom was trying to keep her as that pliable golden child that met her every expectation. And so at this point, it became impossible for Sharon to fit the mold that her mom expected her to fit. And so instead of desperately trying to conform and begging her mom to love her, all of those feelings of desperation and anxiety got pushed into the shadow. And then Sharon basically started to develop a kind of thick skin, a kind of numbness to the dynamic with her mom, where she no longer even felt like she wanted to conform to her mom's expectations. And basically, she almost met her mom with her own kind of stonewalling. So long gone were the days of her being able to be the pliable golden child. And she basically repressed all parts of herself that even wanted to do that. And she had essentially aged out of her mother's good graces. And it even became like a foreign idea to Sharon that she would even want her mother's attention, love, or approval. all she could feel was anger and resistance to her mother. And this carried on in through Sharon's adult years, where all she could feel was this kind of resistance and tension in relation to her mom. Now, if we fast forward to some years in the future when Sharon's 40 years old, and now she's begun a long distance relationship with a guy named John. And John, because of his own traumas, tends to be very hot and cold in relationships. So sometimes John would shower Sharon with all sorts of love and affection, and sometimes he would completely ghost her and ignore her. And whenever this kind of ghosting would happen, Sharon would find herself just begging John, either directly or indirectly, to still love her and not to leave her. And she would be trying to think of all of these different ideas of how to conform to John's expectations of what the ideal partner would be. And she even found herself worrying that maybe she's aged out of John's affections and that he's going to be attracted to younger women instead. But these intense feelings of sadness and anxiety about John's hot and cold behavior weren't just about John. In fact, they weren't even mostly about John. The feelings that she was feeling toward John were actually reflective of the emotions about her mom that she repressed at age 8, those intense feelings of sadness and anxiety she used to feel when she used to beg her mother to love her. So if you notice here, there are some very, very similar patterns to Sharon's relationship to John and her feelings about John compared to her relationship to her mother and her feelings about her mother. For example, the same feelings of anxiety and sadness are coming up with John that came up with her mother. She's begging John to still love her and not to leave her in the same way that she used to beg her mom to still love her and not to leave her. She's trying to come up with ways to impress John and to match up to his expectations of what the ideal partner is in the same way that she tried to match up to her mother's expectations of what the ideal child is. And she's worrying about John being attracted to younger women because she's fearing that she's aged out of John's good graces in the same way that when Sharon turned 8 years old, she could no longer conform to her mom's expectations and she had essentially aged out of her mother's good graces. And in fact, the reason why Sharon was interested in John in the first place is not in spite of the fact that he has these similarities to her mother, but because he has these similarities to her mother. Unconsciously, those parts of her that are repressed, that are still trying to conform to her mother's expectations, that are still feeling the feelings of sadness and anxiety, are essentially feeling like if she can get a good relationship to John, then it's tantamount to getting a good relationship to her mom. So this part of herself is essentially pushing herself to get into a relationship where the same emotions are being activated in hopes of getting a different result from the first time. So if before her mom had these expectations and it's the sense of, oh, I'm going to match up to those expectations and oh no, I failed. This time with John, it's like, oh, if I can actually meet his expectations, then I'm going to be loved. And so it's kind of trying to close the loop on that original situation by engaging with someone that she has similar feelings toward. And unconsciously, Sharon is thinking, if I can get John to love me and not abandon me, then I can get my mom to love me and not abandon me. So this is an example of transference where Sharon was transferring the feelings she had about her mom onto John. Now, as I had mentioned before, there are a lot of issues that can come up as a result of projection and transference, and they can basically lead us back through the same painful, dissatisfying, traumatizing situations that we already experienced in the past. But there is a silver lining to having projections and transferences, and that silver lining is that we can use them to become more and more aware of what's going on with our own psyche and with our own emotions. We can essentially use them as a great asset for shadow work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a few bits of advice for using your projections and transferences to explore deeper into those parts of yourselves or those feelings that you've repressed. So when it comes to noticing your projections, your best friend is going to be looking toward your judgments. So judgments are a great asset for shadow work. So we have a lot of negative connotations around judgments arising because we're like, oh no, I shouldn't be judging people, and maybe I'm bad for judging people. But ultimately, whenever we have certain judgments come up, this can be a great sign that, we're seeing a symptom of a deeper shadow aspect that we've repressed, which is why it's great for being able to essentially reverse engineer our projections and to find what's going on underneath the surface. So whenever we have a judgment towards someone for some neutral reason that we feel like we shouldn't necessarily be judging that person for, like, so for example, let's say I feel feelings of aversion and judgment toward people who are really outgoing, that can show me that maybe I have some parts of myself that are outgoing that I've repressed into the shadow. So, what we want to do is we want to look for our judgments and look toward traits and qualities in others that we just have a negative response to, that maybe we can't even put our finger on why it is that those things bother us. And once you notice yourself judging, you want to ask yourself the following questions. So the first question is, what is it about that person or that trait that I don't like? And the second question is, what feelings come up for me when I see someone engaging in that trait? And the third question is, what meaning am I making out of that trait or that behavior? For example, if I find myself having an aversion or a judgment toward people for being outgoing, am I thinking that, oh, outgoing people are really conceited or really self-centered? If I'm adding a meaning to that, that can be important to look into as well. The fourth thing you'll want to ask is, have I ever expressed that trait before? And if so, why did I stop? And from there, you can ask really any question to like explore deeper into that. But I would start with those 4 questions first. Okay, so that's how you can use projections to work with your shadow. Now we'll go into how to notice your transferences and how those can be used for your own inner work process. So what you want to look at is you want to look at people that you have strong positive or negative feelings about. And just kind of look at those feelings that you're having and think about, has there ever been a time where I've felt this way about someone else? You can also ask yourself, does this person remind me of someone? So if we feel ourselves feeling really strong positive or negative emotions, we can ask, does this person remind me of someone? It can give us a sense of the person that we initially had that feeling about that we're now transferring onto this other person. And then I can ask myself, are these feelings familiar to any feelings that I felt before? So for example, in the example with Sharon, she felt that same sadness and anxiety with her partner, John, in the same way she felt sadness and anxiety with her mom, which could give her a strong clue that she's transferring her feelings about her mom onto John. All right, so those are just a couple of tips that you can use for noticing your projections and transferences and using them for your own inner work process. And basically, when it comes to projections and transferences, we want to keep in mind that it is basically like a projection coming from a projector. So we're basically the projector and the other person becomes the projection screen. And so if you walked into a room and you saw a projector projecting onto the screen, it would be rather foolish to think that you could change something about the projected image by working directly with the projection on the screen. You have to work directly with the projector, not with the thing that's being projected on. So when we're projecting and we're transferring onto another person, if we make it mean a lot about that other person, then that's going to get in the way of our own inner work process. So with Sharon's example, no matter how good her relationship with John gets, it's still not going to resolve those feelings that she has about her mom. She has to deal with those directly. And any type of projection and transference is going to work that way. So sometimes when we project and transfer and we have these strong feelings about other people or strong judgments toward other people, we want to make it about the other person, but really it's about ourselves. Okay, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like to learn about shadow work, I have a free 60-minute shadow integration masterclass called the 6 Steps to Shadow Integration. And if you want to learn about that, you can visit shadowintegration.org/masterclass. And all you have to do is enter your email and you'll have immediate access to the masterclass. So I recommend checking that out. But anyway, that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.